Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all the participants to this inaugural EuroCommerce webinar Policy Talks, in which we really wanted to engage our members, but also friends and our stakeholders on core issues policy debates for our sectors. And we're very pleased to have today Commissioner Hogan that will actually inaugurate this series of policy talks that we will have also during the course of the year. So we will have now 45 minutes, so it's going to be a pretty intense packed program, whereby Commissioner Hogan will start with some initial remarks, and then we will call in Jürgen Roth, who is the Vice President of EuroCommerce from Austria, as a discussant with a couple of minutes remarks and questions. And then we'll have a series of questions that we have received from many of you that have registered to this ahead of time, and also some of the questions that you may put on the chat. Those will be curated by my colleague Neil Macmillan, who is Director of Advocacy and Political Affairs and Trade in EuroCommerce, and get going on that for the next 45 minutes and finish at 11:45. So time is short, but hopefully this will be quite interesting. Commissioner Hogan doesn't need introduction. He is the Commissioner for Trade, now fully confirmed, if I can say, after for the foreseeable future. And of course, we've got to know and appreciate his skills as a talent and effective negotiator already in the previous commission when he was Commissioner for Agriculture. And there, as we all know, agriculture was a very important part of trade negotiations and was instrumental in getting deals with Vietnam, Mercosur, Japan, just to name but a few. EU trade policy is facing many challenges. I think the benefits of free trades are no longer taken for granted, and many parties and governments are also all over the world resorting to economic nationalism and protectionism. Partly as a result of also requests from their electorates. And this is also true whether we see it within the single market or on global trade. And sadly, I think some of those developments remind us, unfortunately, of some of these similar development about 90 years ago. So it is within this context that the Commission came up with a new policy, or at least a start of a consultation note, which is talk about a renewed trade policy for a stronger Europe, and I think within this context, talking about also open strategic economy, that we're very pleased to hear from Phil Hogan, Commissioner for Trade, who will introduce the topics, and then we'll go for discussion. Commissioner Trade, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Good to see you again, and hello to all of your members and those who are participating today. Indeed, it's a great honor to be asked to launch and inaugurate your policy talks on behalf of EuroCommerce, and thank you for doing that. I also want to say hello, as you've already mentioned, to your Austrian member association, the Austrian Economic Chamber, who are hosting their annual Export Day today. So hello to Austria. In fact, talking about exports is a very good place to start our discussion. We are facing a very difficult time ahead because of COVID-19. So we need everybody on board, and we need to adapt and adjust our trade and commercial engines to ensure that we are firing on all cylinders in order to recover as quickly as possible, and as fairly as possible, and as sustainably as possible. And I don't have to remind your members about the huge economic shock that we've just gone through, but I want to express my sincere thanks on behalf of the European Commission to the retailers and wholesalers of Europe, because you have done an outstanding job. You have acted decisively to protect the health and livelihoods of our people, and then of course you have ensured the continuous supply of food and other essential goods to our consumers. And we don't take this for granted, and I know that the people don't take this for granted. Your sector, of course, and your organization is in daily contact with millions of consumers, of course, and you certainly rose to this great challenge from day one. And I have no doubt that the impact would have been a lot worse were it not for the great collaboration that you brought in a holistic way to all of the activities of your members. So now we have to plan for the future, and hopefully we will not be in any way damaged by having to go back a few steps to the past. Trade policy has a very important role to play in our economic recovery, both within the single market and indeed outside our borders. Trade accounts for almost 35% of the European Union's gross domestic product. And we have 35 million European Union jobs that depend on exports and 16 million European jobs that depend on foreign investment. So it's a huge the contribution that trade makes to the commercial, business and economic life of the European Union. It's particularly important, of course, for our SMEs because they represent 87% of all of our EU exporters. And these are, the SMEs are the driving force for our EU export performance. And these SME exports, our companies in the SME sector, they export goods worth 476 billion euros, which represents 28% of the total value of our extra EU exports every year. Now, in many of our economic sectors, the European Union's SMEs account for more than 50% of the total value of EU exports, such as areas textiles, furniture, printing and media, agricultural products and wood products, to name just a few. And our exporting SMEs support over 13 million jobs in Europe. So imports are just as important, and this is not always realized by commentators. We don't have a self-sufficiency in many raw materials in the European Union. So we depend on imports for our businesses and able to drive those businesses. So they're just as important in a global economy based on the international division of labor. In Europe, we need imports to supply our companies, and we have to maintain our competitiveness and our technological edge, and our imports help us to do this. Now, the EU economy, you are well aware of the figures, but I just want to repeat one or two. The EU economy is expected to contract by about 7.4% in 2020, and the global GDP could fall by anything between 3.5% and 4%. So this is huge. And the political environment has seen the escalation of some trends that were already on the rise before the pandemic, including calls for protectionism, economic nationalism, and the rejection of global institutions. So we have to make sure that our trade policy is fully primed and performing to its best at home and abroad, and that's why I'm doing a trade policy review to adapt to these new situations. I launched this trade policy review on the 16th of June, and I have given until September for submissions to be made, and I hope that EuroCommerce will be actively involved in making a number of submissions on behalf of your members, which I know you will. So the COVID-19 is already shaping a new normal, and it presents us with, of course, a necessity and an urgency to take a fresh look at trade and to take a fresh look at the why and how of the policy. And its importance, of course, of trade and investment goes beyond euros and cents. It also has a role to play in promoting our values, our standards around the world. It's a huge relevance for the host of other EU policy priorities as well. It is an integral part of what we're trying to do under our political guidelines and digital trade and the European Green Deal. So all of this is going to mean that we have to adjust all of our policies, including trade, to this reality. You will have known that the recent proposal of the European Commission in relation to the budget for the next 7 years is very important. We are trying to use the budget to leverage whatever we can in terms of implementing our policy priorities. And as business leaders, I know you will be scrutinizing our plans closely to identify the opportunities that are available there. Our aim is to conclude this consultation in trade, as I said, in September, so I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And the review is about striking the right balance between a Europe that is open for business and a Europe that protects its people and its companies. So we call this open strategic autonomy. So the review will need to take account and tackle the issues facing trade policies, such as how to ensure greater resilience, learning the lessons of COVID-19 about how we have to diversify some of our supplies, but at the same time making sure that the restrictions that were put in place are lifted as quickly as possible, that the disruption of our global value chains are repaired, and integrating our green and digital agenda in the future in terms of what we want to do. And finally, we need to look at the level playing field agenda. We're working in our investment negotiations with China to see can we make progress here. And we are making some progress. We still have some time to go. But last January as well, we worked with Japan and the United States on a statement on leveling the playing field on industrial subsidies. So there's various strands of work that are going on there, and also in the WTO, where we're trying to ensure that we have a level playing field for the European companies and that they are not in any way at a disadvantage because of subsidies by state-owned enterprises that are imposed on our by our competitors, and taking business away from European companies in this way. So we're not starting from scratch on our trade policy review. In fact, we have already taken some important steps in the right direction, I think. We want to see what more can we do to ensure that our SMEs can get better value from the existing free trade agreements that we have around the world. We have 76 countries where we have free trade agreements, but we're not getting as much value from the potential of those free trade agreements. And we are looking at establishing a Chief Trade Enforcement Office in the coming weeks within DG Trade that will help us and help our companies to be able to do better, to unlock non-tariff barriers and any other restrictions, but also promote the possibilities for our SMEs. So this hopefully will mean that you will see not only a Europe that's protecting ourselves, but also a Europe that's active on behalf of companies more and more than we have been in the past. So our recently published Trade Barriers Report, this highlights our commitment to using all of the tools at our disposal to support our economies. You will know that we are trying to build a stronger trade defense toolbox as well, because there is no point in issuing a threat to any particular third country about what Europe will do in retaliation if you don't have the tools in order to achieve that. So our new enforcement regulation, our international procurement instrument, strengthening our position regarding the foreign subsidies, all of this is part of a jigsaw of measures that we are taking in order to ensure that any unfair trading practices against European companies are taken on seriously and that we have tools to use in retaliation. We may never use them, but it's good to have them there as a basis of where we can actually act quickly and decisively on behalf of our European interests. Just a brief word on the Wto reform. We are going to be very involved in this process. You cannot have a trade policy without a global referee. Unfortunately, the WTO is certainly not in a good place at the moment. I looked at the opportunity of being the next Director General, as you know, and I've clarified that in the last 24 hours, where I will be continuing as EU Trade Commissioner, because the process of selecting a WTO Director General was likely to continue closer to the end of this year, and this wasn't sustainable from the point of view of a European Union position, and I made a decision not to contest in that regard. But we will be working with the new Director General, whoever he or she is, in order to ensure that our trade agenda and the rules and disciplines associated with trade are made more effective, more efficient, and more responsive on behalf of our companies. On transatlantic relationships, of course, this is a difficult area as well. We trade a lot with the United States, $3 billion a day, but President Trump is obsessed with the balance of trade deficit in goods, where we have an advantage of $180 billion. And he doesn't take account of the fact that we have a lot of companies that export to the United States, and then they go through an intermediate processing stage there, which creates jobs in the United States. And we have many companies where we have, who have their European headquarters and have facilities in the United States that are creating a lot of activity economically and a lot of jobs in the United States. This is not taken into account, unfortunately, by President Trump. So we have to be very much monitoring what's happening in the United States. We have to be diligent in relation to protecting our European companies against unfair tariff impositions, as we see at the moment. We failed to get agreement with the United States on a negotiated settlement to Boeing Airbus, and this has resulted in some tariffs being put on European agricultural products in 22 member states. This is totally unacceptable. We're waiting for the outcome of the Boeing panel in the WTO, which we will have in early September now, I understand. And even though we are trying to negotiate these issues, we are not getting a positive response from the United States at the moment. And this is clouding the issue of a good relationship between the European Union and the United States, and we want to have a good relationship with the United States. I also issued a paper to Ambassador Lighthizer in the United States recently on how we can work together to have a stronger economic recovery together, to have a stronger trade and technology dialogue together, to have more relationship with the United States on energy. So all of these issues are work in progress. We are not making as much progress as we would like, but that's not the fault of the European Union, I can assure you. So judging by the signals coming out of the United States administration in the recent days, I think we could have a turbulent period ahead in the context of the election. I hope not, but we will be doing our very best not to have. But I don't see good positive signals coming from President Trump in recent days about threatening more tariffs on European products, and this is not a good signal. So, in conclusion, Christoph, can I thank you again for allowing me to have this opportunity to formally inaugurate your Policy Talk series. I have given you some overview of the main issues, but of course, I'm not confining myself to those issues if there are any questions you wish to put to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and I think a good overview and also interesting, I think, pointing on the current really big political challenge that we have. So let me call in actually now Jürgen Roth, who is the Vice President of EuroCommerce, very engaged in the WKO or Austrian member. Also, I think an Austrian entrepreneur himself, owner of a petrol station involved in trade, retail trade of mineral oil, and a very strong advocate for trade, as most Austrians are. So, Jürgen.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Commissioner Hogan. Thank you very much for letting me joining in. I'd like to thank you on behalf of EuroCommerce, as I'm Vice President, as you heard before, from EuroCommerce, but I would also like to thank you on behalf of the Austrian Chamber of Commerce. We are right here now in Vienna on the stage at our virtual export day. This day usually takes place once a year physically with more than 3,000 physical participants. This year, due to COVID, we have taken it virtually. We have more than 5,000, 6,000 participants now. So I think it's a great deal that due to COVID, we could at least make it virtually. And thank you very much for your indeed very interesting insights on the EU trade policy. I have a few minutes to let you know about Austrian thoughts probably, and then one or two questions to your side, and if you be so kind to answer them for the Austrian and the EuroCommerce audience. In our understanding, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown the structural vulnerability of our complex and interconnected global economic system. We have seen borders closed. We have seen even transport of goods, especially such as PPE or medical supplies, stopped. We have seen that nationalism in some countries, due to the pandemic and due to a real health crisis, overwhelmed some politicians in charge. And we have seen that the pandemic has raised questions on our dependencies from foreign markets. And even you said before, in times of global health threat, countries will always put their citizens and economy first. So this is on the downside. On the positive side, we see that even though all this, what I said, is relatively true for the last month, the international trade system has prevailed. Especially in Austria, we are very much happy that international transfer of goods, except some small restrictions around the world, worked out fine. European countries now gradually reopen their borders also for people movement freely. And as you said before, this is, it seems, the new normal. But now, you know, we should get out as Europe as a whole out of this crisis. And I think it's a good wording if you say now it's time for Europe. And it's time for sticking together more than ever. Austria especially is very much depending on trade. We are earning more than 6 out of 10 euro due to international trade, and more than half of all the Austrians are depending on their labor and workforce due to international trade. And as you said before, a lot of SMEs in Austrian market, especially the international market, is mostly 98% depending on SMEs. And what are now the learnings out of this crisis? I think 2 or 3 things in Austria really took place. The first is digitalization. Digitalization speeded up dramatically. What would normally need probably 3, 4, 5 years took place in just 1 or 2 single months. So there is a digital EU agenda that we are pretty much looking forward to. The second thing is research and development. I think Europe is on a good way, and especially Austria and some districts in Austria are even #1 in Europe in terms of R&D quota. And I think this is the plan for the future for European international companies to have a high R&D quota, because we can't sell it cheaper than others, and we can't sell it probably more in mass production than our other opponents around the world. And then there is a plea for free trade. And you mentioned before, so many free trade agreements, for example, the one with Vietnam, opening a new market for 90 million people all over the world. We need more and more and more free trade agreements. You said it before, we have a lot of free trade agreements, but I think the mood is not the best concerning free trade. And this is also one of my questions later on, especially our SMEs in Austria. Although we have free trade agreements, we need to help them and guide them on their way to export, because they are not in the physical size and they don't have all the workforce and labor in the back offices to have all the rules and standards fulfilled. So we need to ease up the system for them. And this is one of my questions. What could we do that also to support SMEs to make them benefit from free trade agreements? And my second question would be, you mentioned in your the trade policy review before, in there you mentioned the concept of open strategic autonomy and the guideline. And what does this definition mean in practice? I'm interested in the balance between, on the one hand side, taking care of specific, really interesting and needed products to bring them back to Europe, and on the other hand, to still keep free, open markets in place. This would be my 2 questions. I say thank you again from Austria. Hello from Austria. Hope to see you soon in Brussels. I have some more functions there. It would be great if we could meet once and exchange thoughts, and pretty much happy to be also in charge with EuroCommerce. I think they are doing a great job. Thanks, Christian, also to you, our Director General. I think the European Union is needed more than ever, and I will close with the sentence again, it's time for Europe. Thank you very much from Austria.
Thank you very much, Vice President, for those remarks, and I'm very happy with your closing remark. It's time for Europe, and let's work together because we have a difficult time ahead to bring us through the result of our recent problems. And what we've been trying to do, I suppose, in recent times is trying to lift the restrictions that were put in place on a temporary basis, internally and externally. Internally, we had to bring in this export authorization measure in the early days to make sure that our leading member countries of the European Union were in a better place than they were in the initial few weeks. And this has worked reasonably well. We regret that we had to do this, but I think it got everybody into a better political space by doing so in the beginning. And we terminated the measure as quickly as we could. So therefore, we were proportionate and we were very transparent about it. Secondly, I worked externally to try and lift restrictions with the WTO monitoring group and the G20. Not as successful yet, but it's early days, but we keep the pressure on. Thirdly, I've tried to, with the help of some countries like Canada, like Norway, we're trying to push the notion of reducing tariffs on essential goods where we're vulnerable and dependent, like medical and pharmaceutical. Mm-hmm. And this is an initiative now that we are pushing with other countries in the WTO on a plurilateral basis. I'm disappointed that the United States has not joined us because they want to increase tariffs, which I'm amazed to see that this is the policy response, because it has the unintended consequence of driving up prices for consumers at a time I would have thought that it was in all our interest to drive down restrictions and drive down prices. But anyway, this is the way we are. On the issues that you've mentioned and the lessons, the digitalization agenda, of course, this is the big lesson. And this is in keeping with what we have in our political guidelines in the European Commission, which were agreed by the European Council and the European Parliament. The green agenda and the digital agenda are the two big flagship initiatives. So as we recover, we have to integrate the sustainability agenda and the digital agenda. And this is very good timing from that point of view. So if we're going to spend money together, let's spend it in a way that's sustainable for the future and gives us a good, positive, sustainable growth for the future. Our clean technologies through our R&D programs hopefully will emerge from this as well and give businesses in Europe an opportunity to be able to be at the forefront of some of the new technologies and be able to compete, albeit on a fairly, with countries like China in the future. I want to totally agree with you on the issue to maintain global connectivity. The lesson of digital is that we're global whether we like it or not. You cannot have restrictions on borders, when you're actually trying to promote a digital trade agenda. We will never be self-sufficient in Europe in relation to what we need. But what we're saying by open strategic autonomy is we're saying that we identify the dependencies, the vulnerabilities, especially in the medical area. We can look at maybe what we did in the oil crisis of the 1970s, where we came up with this idea of strategic reserves over 90 days. And this can be done, of course, by production within the European Union or production in our immediate neighborhood, but also can be done by stockpiling. And many of the raw materials and many of the components that we need in Europe for our businesses come from outside the European Union. So we should not cut off our supply chains just because we have this political philosophy that everything will be fine if we have everything local. It won't, and we'll never be able to achieve this. So we have to be pragmatic, practical about the areas where we're vulnerable, but the main fair and free trade, eliminating unfair trading practices, making sure that Chinese companies are not able to operate directly and indirectly by subsidizing through state-owned enterprises and competing unfairly against our European companies, having a stronger economic and trade defense toolbox to be able to ensure that we get reciprocity in many of the third country markets where there are barriers to entry. I'm very happy to hear you saying we need more free trade agreements, but I have bad news here. That's unlikely to happen. Certainly, we see some difficulties here in the ratification process of Mercosur will even be a challenge, as you know, from Austria, indeed from other countries. But we continue to work on the basis that we have 270 million people that are prepared to do business with us. We have 5 billion of a reduction in savings to our European companies on duties and taxes, and still we have people against this. And at the same time, we have adapted Brazil and other countries who are reluctant to the Paris Agreement. We have integrated and through trade policy brought about a situation where Brazil, for the first time, are in favor of the climate agreement. And we want to throw away this opportunity, which seems rather strange for people that are interested in the subject of sustainability and the European Green Deal. We are establishing a Chief Trade Enforcement Office, which I hope our SMEs will be able to avail of. I would like to see this operational, as soon as possible. I'm thinking now of September. Because of COVID, we had some delays. And this office will help to give greater focus on SMEs and export opportunities, but also remove and reduce non-tariff barriers that we have in some of our markets and get better bang for our buck in terms of the deals we already have done. So these are the areas, and thank you very much from Austria for your export day, but also your very strong words on being very aligned to the European objectives on trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you very much, Jürgen, as well for bringing this in and also for the great support again we have from Austria. So now we have about 15 minutes left. If you agree, Commissioner, I'm going to turn to my colleague Neil Macmillan, who has been curating all the questions that we have received and sort of group them together. So if you agree, we're just going to take them sort of a batch of 3 questions, if that's okay with you, and then you can answer them, as briefly as you can, and then we can have a second batch, and hopefully maybe also a third batch. Neil, welcome.
Hi, Commissioner, and thanks very much indeed. Also, so if I can join with Christian in welcoming you here. I've at the moment got 12 questions, and I'm trying to group them together in a way which I hope is easier to answer. So the first batch, I thought we would try and group together things to do with food, since that obviously has a past resonance with you as well. So the first one is from Dirk Jacobs from Food Drink Europe, who is really asking about the potential tension between the Commission's trade agenda of obviously opening up markets for our exporters, but also allowing imports of food. But we've seen obviously pressure from a number of areas on shorter food supply chains, self-sufficiency, and at its worst within the EU, gastro-nationalism. So I think the question is, how do you strike that balance between opening up markets and some pressures to close ours? The second one is from Alexander Anton from the European Dairy Association, who you know well, and really talking particularly about the New Zealand FTA and the pressure from New Zealand to find more access, particularly in dairy, but I think also in meat. And how do you see, again, striking that balance between protecting EU dairy interests and striking a deal with the New Zealanders? And the last of this batch is from Lisbeth Dendas of Animal Health Europe. And she's really asking about some of the restrictions that we've imposed on animal products coming in from outside Europe, things like antimicrobials or the ban of use of antibiotics as growth promoters, and whether you see this as a potential vulnerability for the EU in terms of retaliation from those affected. So they're fairly complicated questions, but I'll stop there and let you have a chance to answer.
Well, the first one is about, I don't see tensions actually between the short supply chain statements being made by Commissioner for Agriculture and Food and also the possibility and the importance of having open trade opportunities for our food exporters. I don't think there'd be too many jobs in our rural areas if we didn't have food exports. For every 1 billion of food exports, we have 15,000 jobs created. So I don't think any commissioner would want to be in a position defending the closure of these particular food companies on the grounds of self-sufficiency. It's not possible. As I said earlier, the notion that we are going to be self-sufficient in everything is certainly not realistic, and it won't happen. We depend on raw materials, but also we depend on markets around the world to sustain many jobs in our European Union. And agriculture and food is a primary driver of employment in our rural areas, and I believe that that will continue. And under the open strategic autonomy concept, what is envisaged here is that where we have strategic reason to diversify away from being dependent on a market like China, or where we have a need to watch our vulnerabilities like the medical area, of course then we will take some actions. But these are identified in our proposals. There are a finite number of areas in our budget proposals. They're not a broad range across the board in terms of every market area. So I want to reassure people that we will continue to have every possibility, as far as I'm concerned, for food companies to be able to export around the world. And of course, the consumers of Europe will be able to make a choice then at local level about local production or wherever production comes from. Anton, we have recently had some discussions with New Zealand. I think the dairy sector, of course, are already under some pressures from the New Zealand market, but also the New Zealand, as you know, have significant investments in the European Union. And we have to wait and see the outcome of Brexit to see what the landing ground will be for many of the issues affecting the New Zealand-European Union trade talks. I've signalled this recently to the New Zealand authorities, and they have elections in September as well. So what we have tabled is well within the scope of the European dairy sector, where we have major advances made, which I don't hear much about in relation to where we can export a lot of dairy products to Japan and Canada and Mexico, and indeed Mercosur. One of the big winners on this was dairy, but I always hear about the beef sector. So you have to shout a little bit louder, Anton, in relation to the positivity that we're doing in trade for the dairy sector, and we'll be very mindful of the sensitivity of the dairy sector on the New Zealand negotiations. On the third part of your question, this is a very difficult issue politically, issues around antibiotics, animal welfare, MRLs, pesticides. that agenda and biotech, that agenda is very difficult politically to get anything other more prescriptiveness and more ambition in relation to these issues, and that's where the push is coming from. But I would like to see, everybody signing up to a science-based approach at the highest levels politically in the European Union. And if we get, people to sign up to the science-based approach, well, then they have to accept the independence of our agencies and coming up with the solutions, not to be, cherry-picking the good and the not so good from time to time. So, we have to have an independent science-based approach, and that's the essence and that's the principle. But I believe that we have to rededicate our political leaders to this concept.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner. Those are really excellent answers. My next three, I'm going to perhaps combine a number of questions together in looking at WTO and the overall protectionist versus free trade arguments. The first of these would come from three people. One is Jiří Mareček from Ahold Delhaize in the Czech Republic. The next one is, I'm afraid, somebody who didn't give us his name properly, so I can't actually say who he is. And the third one is from Karl Pisec from WKO and from Martin Messner, also in Austria. And the question I'd like to try and combine to say is the following. First of all, what can the EU and the Commission do to try and explain a little bit better to the public that protectionism often is driven by the interests of a rather narrow part of the economy, or indeed sometimes individual companies, rather than the wider good of the economy as a whole? The second part of that is, what can we do without creating even more tension and trade wars to take a stronger stance against the US? And the third element of that would be how far we are able to improve our relationship, or not for that matter, with Russia, which obviously has been a little bit of a political difficulty in this respect.
Well, on the last question, it's above my pay grade, but it's a matter for Russia, how we actually improve relationships, because, we made a political decision at the highest levels about what happened in Crimea was wrong, and the sanctions are imposed, and a trade commissioner doesn't have the competence to deal with that. It's a matter for the prime ministers and heads of government, but there's a good reason why the sanctions are there. So if Russia wants to normalize its relationship with the European Union, well, then it has to take steps along the lines, to remove the sanctions. Will require them to take some political steps. To avoid trade wars is something that I'm actually trying to do, by trying to manage the relationship with the United States is not an easy one. But at the same time, we're still talking. And we've resumed negotiations with the United States some weeks ago, arising from little time out because of the COVID-19 issues. But we're up for a small confidence-building deal with the United States. We have a lot of things we agree on, but we're waiting for the timing when President Trump is actually has made up his mind whether he wants to have a deal or not. That's where it's at, and if he does, we are ready. On protectionism, I think the only way that we can deal with the issue of protectionism and all of the issues around populism is to push back as often as we possibly can. And I often say this, so I'm not saying this in any disrespectful way, but we need to have companies everywhere who perceive that it is positive to have free and open trade to say so more regularly. We unfortunately in the media we hear too often about the losers. We rarely hear from the winners. So it's a constant. I know it's a constant battle to get positive news into the media, because media generally they put negative headlines sells media, but we have to keep trying, and we have to all look at the ways in which we communicate these days, because the old traditional ways of communicating are not working. And therefore we have to fine-tune our media strategies in our companies, with our employees, but also in our member states, to make sure that the companies get the message to the politicians, and the politicians get a positive sense that trade is good, and creating a lot of jobs and a lot of economic activity that would not otherwise be the case. So we will work, and it's a constant battle here within the European system, but the European system will never achieve this. It has to come from bottoms-up approach with the guidance and help and support and information that we're willing to provide in every possible way. But it's a partnership, and I think that we need to work closely together in a better way than we have been in the past to get better outcomes.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think time flies, and but we still have time for maybe a last batch of 2-3 questions. So I think if we can have those, I think Neil, I think it would be richer conversation. Go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed, and I will now try and keep this fairly quick because I'm not going to be able to ask you all the questions we've got here, but I hope that those people who have put them will also understand that we can't get them all together. I think the next question, or groups of questions I'd like to ask you about, is to do with the Trade Enforcement Officer. There's one here from Pascal Canais, who you know very well from the European Services Forum, asking about whether the role will just be a defensive one, or whether there will be a help in some way, and this takes up a point that Jürgen Roth made, in helping SMEs to get into the export market. You gave us some very impressive figures. But we know from our own sector that SMEs, if the trade barriers are too high, they just give up. They don't export because they just don't have the resources to do it, as Jürgen said. The second thing to do with that really is from Hans Karpels from Euronics and from Lourdes Marina Perez from the Fratini Vanano law firm. How do we make sure that the Chief Enforcement Officer can also play a role in what is being described in the industrial strategy and in the discussion on recovery after COVID about diversification away from China and return to manufacturing in the EU? Is that something you'd envisage him dealing with? And a last question from Paulina Bastidon of Spirits Europe, and also from an anonymous caller. What can we do, given the delay in us being able to retaliate under WTO rules on the Boeing Airbus case, to help those sectors, for example, in the spirits sector, to recover from what is actually quite a large blow with the very high 25% tariffs which the US has put together? And if it's not too much to ask you, finally, the future of the appellate body in the WTO doesn't look good. And do you have any immediate ideas of how we can get the WTO working again on such disputes such as Boeing? Sorry, that was rather a complicated last question. But
I can answer those quickly enough. First of all, on the Chief Trade Enforcement Office, I don't see it as a defensive office. I see this as an offensive, assertive office on behalf of companies and on behalf of business to be done in the European Union. Removing non-tariff barriers, making sure that we have proper implementation and enforcement of existing free trade agreements where there might be dragging of feet, as it were, in relation to some of the implementation issues. And I envisage a special strategy for SMEs, which I will be saying something about in the autumn time in September. So I will be consulting with organizations like EuroCommerce to see what is the best practice and how is the best way we can work together and help you to be able to get more opportunities in the export area, whether it's through a promotion or whatever. So we will be engaging with you in the coming weeks to try and establish what are the practical steps that we can work together on. But I can assure you that this is this organization, or this unit that we're establishing, is about selling on behalf of European companies abroad, and also removing barriers where they exist, whether they're tariff or non-tariff. And in the conjunction with that, the question about diversification, I don't see this Chief Trade Enforcement Office being involved in this, but I do see an opportunity for, under our budget proposals, for InvestEU to give some financial support in that program for various sectors where we are vulnerable in the COVID-19 pandemic, where we see we were vulnerable and where we see the need for diversification. And they're listed in the MFF proposal. So you'll see the areas, and principally it's around health and medical and digital. And I think defense might be mentioned as well. So these are key areas where we actually see the need for the European Commission and the European Union to be more proactive in making sure that Europe is not vulnerable in these sectors and that we're not exposed to one geographical location for these products in the future. And we learned that lesson. So but that doesn't mean that's a very small number of sectors relative to the overall business that's done by European companies around the world. So it's just targeting some financial support there. On the retaliation of Boeing Airbus, we have made 2 attempts to negotiate a settlement with the United States, and they have been rejected. And 3 weeks ago, when I spoke to Ambassador Lighthizer about this, he said he was in a very comfortable position because now they have unilaterally declared Boeing to be in compliance with the WTO ruling. Now, I don't think this ever happened before, that you can unilaterally declare compliance. But anyway, this is the times we're in. The WTO has not declared that Boeing is in compliance, but Airbus is coming into compliance, and we expect the ruling of on the WTO panel on Boeing in early September, and we are ready to retaliate if we don't have an agreed outcome by then. And this is the way we have to be, because unfortunately, if products are being targeted by the United States in an irresponsible way, well, we cannot stand idly by. We have to stand up for European business and companies and European industrial and trade policy, and our agricultural products are being unfairly targeted by this tariffs imposed because of the Airbus ruling. Since last October, it's a lot of money, gobbled up, unfortunately, by the United States at the expense of European agri-food companies in particular. On the appellate body, we have brought in a temporary stopgap measure called the multi-party arbitration system in order to ensure that many countries who have a dispute are able to find a mechanism on an interim basis to have a solution found. The United States are outside the room, unfortunately, but I have some ideas that I will be announcing in due course about how we can actually reform the appellate body, meet some of the analysis that has been given to us by the United States on a regular basis. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a consensus approach within the WTO, but we will certainly be making positive proposals about WTO reform and the need for a 2-tier independent adjudication system in the near future.
Very good, and I think time unfortunately is up now. I think we've gone a little bit over time, but I think it was worth it. So thank you very much, Commissioner, for really exposing all the ideas and responding very well to all those questions. I think this first policy webinar worked very well, and that is also thanks to you, to your usual plain talking, calm but plain talking as we know you, and I think that is very much appreciated. We know we have a very strong commissioner in charge of trade, and I think in these difficult times, I think this is very important. Thanks also, Jürgen, to your participation, all your Austrian friends from participating in the Export Day. Thanks to all our viewers and listeners for participating. I understand there were more than 200 of them, friends, and I think it was also the format worked very well. We took a lot of questions from our friends and allies and stakeholders in this, and this is actually how this COVID crisis also has brought this idea together of stronger cooperation across value chains, across ecosystems. Thanks, Neil, for having facilitating the Q&A, curated the questions, Vincent for all the backup technology. Commissioner, thank you very much, and you can count on us. We will definitely, of course, provided input into your consultation from EuroCommerce as well as from our members, and looking forward, because as you said, it's the time of Europe. It's the time to continue to, I think, keep a trade open. We've seen actually that the trade was about to be ground to a halt also within Europe at the very beginning of the crisis, and I think it's very good that Europe indeed intervened and together with the member states to keep the trade flowing. Thank you all very much. We wish you all a very good day, and talk to you soon. And more news to come on our second, policy talk in the next few weeks. Thank you. Bye bye,
Commissioner. Thank you. Bye bye.
Exporttag 2020.